The scandal that sank the Catholic Church in the USA. Boston, Massachusetts, 1976-2002. There are institutions that the world considers sacred, and there are secrets that these institutions protect with all their might. Boston, Massachusetts, one of the most Catholic cities in America. For more than a century, the Catholic Church had been the heart of this community. Baptisms, weddings, funerals, confessions, first communions. The most intimate moments in the lives of millions of families passed through the hands of the priests of this city. The trust was total, absolute, built generation after generation. And it was this trust that made what happened next not just a crime, but an unprecedented betrayal in American history. This is the story of how one of the most powerful institutions in the world protected its criminals. The scandal that sank the Catholic Church in the USA. The institution. The Catholic Church in Boston, power and presence. To understand the magnitude of what happened in Boston, it is first necessary to understand what the Catholic Church represented in that city. In the mid-20th century, about 60% of Boston's population identified as Catholic. They were Irish, Italian, Polish, Portuguese, immigrant families who had brought their faith as the most prized possession they held. The church was not just a place of prayer. It was the community center, the college, the hospital, the foster home, the informal court of honor. In many families, the local priest was the most authoritative figure after the father. In some, even before him. This power was not merely spiritual, it was social, economic, and political. The Cardinals of Boston had direct access to mayors, governors, and senators. A word from the Archbishop could determine elections, influence contracts, open or close doors. It was an institution that had been built upon centuries of genuine devotion. And it was precisely this capital of trust, accumulated by generations of believers, that would be used to cover up the uncoverable. The priest, a figure of trust. The priest was the intermediary between God and the community. That was the theology. But in the daily practice of American life, the priest was also the family counselor, the catechism teacher, the organizer of summer camps, the leader of youth groups. There was a logic to access that would be unthinkable in any other institution today. Children went to the rectory alone. They spent weekends on retreats organized by the priests. They traveled with the parish. Parents not only allowed it, they were proud. That their child spent time with the priest was considered a blessing. This trust was not naive. It was the product of decades of genuinely exemplary behavior from most members of the clergy. It was rational within the context in which it had been built. And it was precisely this rationality that some priests systematically, deliberately, and with protection exploited. It wasn't an isolated failure, it was a system failure. The secrets. John Geoghegan, the first name. The name that would change everything was John Geoghegan. Geoghegan had been ordained a priest in 1962 and spent the following decade serving in different parishes of the Archdiocese of Boston. He was charismatic with children, active in the community, esteemed by the parishioners of Filigi, and he had sexually abused more than 130 children over 3 decades. The number didn't emerge all at once. It was revealed gradually, over years, as victim after victim found the courage to speak out. But the story begins long before the first public revelations. It begins in 1979, when the Archdiocese of Boston received the first formal complaint against Geoghegan. The church's response was immediate and revealing. Geoghegan was removed from the parish where the complaint had surfaced. He was transferred to another parish with children. The cover-up system, how it worked? The cover-up was not improvised. It had a logic, a structure, a protocol that would be repeated in different cases, in different dioceses, over decades. The pattern was always the same. A complaint would arrive. The diocesan leadership would evaluate it. The accused priest would be removed, not fired, just transferred. Frequently, he would be sent for treatment to a specialized center for clergy in a closed setting. Weeks or months later, he would receive a certificate stating that he was treated and fit for ministry. Then he was reassigned to another city, to another parish, with access to new children who knew nothing. When the victims' families confronted the church, they often received 2 things: a promise that the priest had been removed, true but incomplete, and a silent, sometimes explicit, request that the matter not be taken to the police, so as not to scandalize the community. so as not to harm the institution, so as not to hurt the innocent people who depended on the church. Some families accepted this narrative. Others received financial settlements accompanied by confidentiality clauses. Silence was bought, and when it couldn't be bought, it was imposed. Cardinal Law, the man at the center. At the center of it all was Bernard Francis Law. Law had been appointed Archbishop of Boston in 1984 and elevated to Cardinal in 1985, one of the highest titles within the Catholic hierarchy, second only to the Pope. He was a man of great intelligence, charismatic presence, and free access to the corridors of the Vatican and American political power. And he was the man who, fully aware of the crimes being committed within his archdiocese, continued transferring abusive priests from parish to parish for years. The letters he signed, later discovered and filed among internal documents, would show that Law knew, that he had received reports, that he had made decisions, that he had repeatedly chosen to protect the institution over the children, the victims. The voices that nobody heard, stories of the victims. The victims existed before the files, they existed before the newspapers, they existed before any investigation. These were children who returned home after meetings with the priest and didn't know how to name what had happened. They felt ashamed of something they hadn't caused. They tried to tell their parents and were sometimes disbelieved because the priest was the priest, and the priest couldn't have done that. Many of these children grew up carrying the secret alone. Some developed alcohol and drug addiction in their teens. Some attempted suicide, some succeeded. One of the survivors, in testimony given decades later, described what the abuse had cost him with a precision that left the entire courtroom silent. He didn't steal my childhood. He stole my ability to trust anyone for the rest of my life. This testimony was not an exception. It was the norm, repeated in variations by hundreds of survivors who, over the years, would meet each other and discover that what they had carried in isolation was, in fact, a collective experience, deliberately kept isolated by the institution that was supposed to protect them. Why did it take so long? The mechanism of silence. The question many people ask when they hear this story is inevitable. Why did it take so long? The answer is complex and uncomfortable. There was fear. The priest was an unquestionable authority in the community. Accusing him meant risking social isolation in neighborhoods where the church was the center of everything. A family that spoke against a priest could lose friends, community ties, even businesses. There was shame. The victims, children at the time of the abuse, internalized a guilt that wasn't theirs, but which the silence surrounding them reinforced. If no one spoke, if the priest continued celebrating Mass and being treated with respect, what did that say about what had happened to them? There was disbelief. Several victims who tried to speak out, to their parents, to other priests, to authority figures, were discredited. Some were called liars. Some were sent to psychologists with the implicit instruction that the problem lay with them. And above all, there was the architecture of cover-up. The church had built, over decades, such an efficient system for containing scandals that individual, isolated voices were simply absorbed and silenced before they reached any public sphere. Then 4 journalists arrived. Journalism. At the Boston Globe, I keep a spotlight. In July 2001, Marty Barron took over as editor-in-chief of the Boston Globe. It was his first day in a city he didn't know, at the helm of a newspaper that had covered the Catholic Church with a deference that, in retrospect, many within the newspaper itself would question. One of the first things Barron did was read a column published months earlier about Father Geoghegan. The column mentioned that the Archdiocese had transferred the priest dozens of times despite complaints. Barron asked his investigative team a simple question. Why wasn't this thoroughly investigated? The Globe's Spotlight team, a long-established investigative journalism unit, was given the task, not to cover the Geoghegan case, to investigate whether there was a systematic pattern. What they found would change the history of the Catholic Church in the United States. The investigation, pulling the threads. The investigation lasted for months. The team began with public records of civil lawsuits, cases where victims had sued the church and reached settlements. Many of these documents were sealed, but the records that the cases existed were public. There were dozens, then hundreds. Each name led to another. Each sealed case suggested a confidentiality agreement. Each confidentiality agreement confirmed that the church knew, and had chosen to pay for silence rather than act. Journalist Sasha Pfeiffer would later describe the moment when the scale of what they were discovering became impossible to ignore. There was a list. We started with about 12 names, then 20, then 50. At one point, one of our researchers came into the room with a new list and said, "There are at least 87 priests in Boston alone." And we fell silent. Publication, January 6, 2002. On January 6, 2002, the Boston Globe published the first article in the Spotlight series. The headline stated that the Archdiocese of Boston had systematically, for decades, transferred priests accused of sexually abusing children from parish to parish, instead of reporting them to the authorities. Cardinal Law's name appeared explicitly. Documents were cited. Standards were demonstrated with irrefutable evidence. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. In the following weeks, more than 800 victims contacted the newspaper. The collapse. The reaction. A nation confronts the church. What happened in the weeks and months following the publication of the Spotlight series is unparalleled in the history of the American Catholic Church. The repercussions spread from Boston to the entire country. Newspapers in every major American city began their own investigations. In diocese after diocese, the same pattern emerged. Different names, different geographies, but the same system of transfers, cover-ups, and sealed deals. The victims, who had carried their stories in silence for decades, began to speak out. Not little by little, but in a torrent. Support groups were formed, lawyers specializing in cases. Faithful who had dedicated their lives to the church found themselves facing an impossible choice. How could they continue to believe in an institution that had demonstrably protected predators instead of children? Many left. Silently, painfully, permanently. Cardinal Law, the fall. Bernard Law resisted for months. He tried to control the damage with carefully crafted pronouncements. He admitted generic errors without admitting specific responsibilities. He asked for forgiveness without specifying for what. It didn't work. In April 2002, internal documents from the Archdiocese were released by court order. These were letters signed by Law that confirmed, without any ambiguity, that he had known about Gayogan's abuses since at least 1984, that he had approved transfers, that he had authorized the return of priests to the ministry after treatments that the psychiatrists themselves had deemed insufficient. The pressure became unbearable. Groups of victims demanded his resignation. Priests from the Archdiocese itself, a rare act of courage within such a rigid hierarchy, publicly asked him to step down. In December 2002, Bernard Law traveled to Rome, and he submitted his resignation to Pope John Paul II. The Pope accepted it. Law was never criminally prosecuted in the United States. He was appointed by the Vatican as archpriest of one of Rome's largest basilicas, an honorary position that would cause renewed outrage among survivors and activists. He would die in Rome in 2017, at the age of 86, without having faced charges in any American court. National reach. It wasn't just Boston. Boston was the beginning. It was not the exception. In the investigations that followed over the years, the pattern of systematic cover-up was documented in dioceses in all 50 American states. In 2004, a report commissioned by the American bishops themselves, the John J. Report, concluded that more than 4,000 priests had been accused of sexually abusing minors in the United States between 1950 and 2002. More than 4,000. And the estimated number of victims exceeded 10,000 documented cases. The legacy. The Pulitzer Prize in Journalism as a Shield. In 2003, the Boston Globe's Spotlight team received the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service, the highest honor in American journalism. The prize wasn't for writing ability. It was for what journalism had done, opened a door that one of the world's most powerful institutions had kept closed for decades. Marty Barron, the editor who had asked the initial question, would talk about the case in speeches and interviews for years, always with the same emphasis. What the team had done was not heroic. It was what journalism should always do. The question wasn't whether we should publish, he would say. The question was why we hadn't published it before. What has changed and what hasn't changed? The legal consequences were enormous. The Catholic Church in the United States would pay more than $3 billion in settlements to victims over the following decades. Some dioceses declared bankruptcy. Dozens of priests were criminally prosecuted and convicted. The institutional consequences were significant. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops implemented new child protection policies, the so-called Dallas Standards of 2002, which established mandatory reporting procedures and the removal of accused individuals. But the survivors, those who lived to see all of this, were unanimous in their assessment. The changes were real, and they were insufficient. Cases continued to emerge. In 2018, a Pennsylvania grand jury documented the abuse of more than 1,000 children by 300 priests over 7 decades, in just 6 dioceses in the state. In 2019, investigations in other states revealed similar patterns. The cover-up structure had been shaken. It hadn't been dismantled. Epic closing. The Catholic Church has existed for 2,000 years. It survived wars, persecutions, schisms, inquisitions, reforms, and counter-reforms. It built civilizations. It preserved knowledge. It fed the hungry, cared for the sick, and educated entire generations. None of this is denied by this story. But none of that cancels out this story. An institution is not sacred simply because it proclaims itself sacred. What the Boston scandal revealed was not just the crime of individuals. It revealed what happens when any institution, religious, political, corporate, puts its own survival above the responsibility it has to the people who trust it. And he revealed what happens when 4 journalists ask the question no one wanted to ask. The victims existed before the files. They existed before newspapers. They existed before any recognition. And they deserve to be remembered not as statistics, but as they always were, for all the victims who have spoken out, and for those who couldn't make it.